So hi, my name is John Zanzuris, and I currently work for the College of Medical Laboratory Technologists of Ontario in member relations and policy. My educational background is varied. I started at McMaster doing an undergrad in biochemistry. From there, I went to the Michener Institute for Applied Health Sciences, where I completed a certificate in molecular genetics, became licensed as a lab technologist in Ontario, and started professional practice in clinical laboratories. Early on in my professional career, I realized that while the bench work was interesting, I wanted to expand my horizons educationally and with experience. So I went back to school and started a very long career as a lifelong student. So I went back and did a part-time degree in health administration while working. That led to my first job in management at Mount Sinai Hospital. And from there, I went into public policy after gaining a little bit of an interest and a love for public policy through some of my instructors in my health admin degree. So I went back and did a master's in public policy and administration part-time while working. Moved to the Michener Institute for Applied Health Sciences, working in policy and managing and continuing education, and then from there to our provincial regulatory body. So I feel that I've been very fortunate in my career in that I've had a variety of roles and responsibilities in a variety of aspects of our healthcare world, from frontline work to management to education and now regulation. I think when we're talking about leadership in healthcare and leading in healthcare, I think we need to kind of first off set a little bit of a context of what leadership in healthcare looks like as opposed to other industries, particularly the private sector or maybe education, but more the private sector. And I think some of those contextual pieces in healthcare are what set healthcare out as unique from some of these other industries. So the first being the funding model. Everything is publicly funded. So the money's not coming from private investors. You're not looking at return on investment, or if you are, it's a different way of looking at return on investment. And the funding is finite. So there are constant budgetary pressures when you're working in healthcare, which has been my experience. And that puts a context around what leadership can and will look like. The second piece is the professionals that work in healthcare. Most of these professionals went into healthcare to serve patients and to focus on patient care. So there's a social responsibility and social contract there that I believe is a little bit more prevalent than it might be in other industries. And I believe that also has a contextual force on what leadership looks like in healthcare. So these types of forces, in my mind, color what leadership looks like. So that includes what kind of skills one might need, how one might apply those skills, what kind of behaviors are expected, what kind of trends do we see. So that's my view in the broader sense of what leadership in healthcare might look like and how it's a little bit different than leading in other industries. But there's another piece that I think is important to parse out, and that's the difference between leadership and management. In my view, and there's a ton of literature on the difference between leadership and management, but my personal view is that management is more of a hard set of skills that one can learn that is affected by your personal beliefs, values, behaviors, and so on. So you can write your budget, you can approve vacation requests, you can do all the things that are involved in management, and your personal style, behavior, your professional demeanor will color how those things happen. Leadership, in my mind, is kind of the opposite. It's a set of skills, but it's more impacted by your personal belief system, values, professional behaviors, and so on. The common theme through all of this in healthcare and the skills that are required by leaders in healthcare is a focus on patient care. I think that being able to focus on patient care as the prime directive is really what, again, colors what skills are required as a leader. And so the first piece of that is being a professional. What does that mean? What does being a professional really mean? In my professional world, we talk about professionalism as the way that you act even when nobody's looking. So what is the culture that you bring? What are the behaviors that you bring as a professional that others then experience as your behaviors and get a mental image of what you look like as a professional? So the example I always use is if you close your eyes and say the word doctor, you get an image in your mind of what a doctor looks and feels like. If you close your eyes and you say nurse, same sort of thing. So that's the mental image that you get. Well, leader has and invokes certain images as well. And that's supported by some of the skills that one needs in healthcare. So in terms of some of the competencies or skills that a leader in healthcare needs, in my opinion, again, colored by some of those trends and themes that I already mentioned, have to do with looking at quality, so being able to manage quality, focus on quality, focusing on effectiveness, and focusing on collaboration. And I believe that these are the current skill sets that are required. And I say current skill sets because, again, as healthcare is publicly funded, it is also, in my opinion, highly affected by public policy trends. And these are some of the current public policy trends: a focus on quality, a focus on efficiency and effectiveness, and a focus on collaboration. My experience has been that it's been local solutions to local problems. So although there's a policy drive to embed interprofessional collaboration, really there's a lot of enablers and there's a lot of barriers. And again, there's a lot of literature written on this. And what happens at the local level will depend on how those enablers and barriers play out. But let me use a specific example in the medical laboratory technology world to demonstrate. So in a previous employment, there were some issues that were occurring in the core laboratory with turnaround times, and specifically with turnaround times from samples coming from the emergency department. And you can imagine that's a high-risk, high-stress environment where they expect a certain level of service. And what the nurses were finding was they were drawing specimens from patients, sending them to the core lab, and they were whether mislabeled, unlabeled, or the wrong specimen. And the lab would receive them, and they have their processes to follow and procedures to follow. And they're grounded in patient care. You cannot accept a specimen that is unlabeled. Even if somebody calls you after the fact and says, "Trust me, it's Mr. Smith," it doesn't work that way. What if it's not Mr. Smith? And so the nurses were calling the lab and talking to the MLTs, and were getting quite upset about the lack of responsiveness of the turnaround times. And the MLTs in turn would say, well, okay, but you sent X, Y, and Z specimen, it was mislabeled. And the nurses felt that this was an attack on them, and communication fell apart, essentially. So what happened was the managers of both departments took a leaderful role, I believe, in rising above the issues, which were very important, and looking at it from a process perspective. And got together with a couple of the nurses from the emergency department and the medical laboratory technologists and spoke process. Instead of, this is what happened, I did this, why didn't you do this? Let's look at the patient experience. So this goes back to interprofessional collaboration. Let's look at the patient experience. Now in this case, the patient experience isn't that they actually have to go and get their blood drawn and go to the lab and wait for their result. But the patient experience is they have their blood drawn and they're waiting for a result in the emergency to determine their next course of action. So it is pretty high anxiety in some cases. And they wanted to reduce those turnaround times. The med lab technologists got to learn about the nurses, and the nurses, for their part, got to learn about process in the laboratory and some of the things that could improve the turnaround times. So they started to chart some of the data around some of the more important tests or the more high volume tests that the nurses were ordering. And this is important because one of the other things that supports interprofessional collaboration is proof, data. Show us that working together actually makes a difference. And this is an example of where working together did make a difference. Because what happened was they saw an observable reduction in turnaround times and an observable reduction in specimen errors, which affected turnaround times. So these folks working together, being able to break down their boundaries, being able to speak a common language and focus on process, I believe is what enabled change. The example that I'm thinking of is in my current role, where we're looking at a very broad but important public policy issue, which is the regulation of a new health profession. This is a very complicated and very complex project that is affected by a whole variety of different things, one of which, of course, is the trends in public policy, trends in professional regulation. So I have to have a very macro level view of what's happening in the healthcare system. At the kind of next level down is what I believe to be a strategic view. So if we want to do this, why do we want to do it? Are we clear on why we want to do it? Can we communicate that clearly? Is there transparency? And then how do we actually go about doing it? At a strategy level then, I believe that now starts to cross over into a more on-the-ground operation level. So you have to keep an eye on the broader perspective, you have to keep an eye on the strategy perspective, and you have to keep an eye on the operations perspective. Because as we may talk about a little bit later, sometimes you make policy decisions that have unintended consequences that you may not have foreseen, or may have foreseen but still have to mitigate and deal with. So in this initiative that I'm involved with and leading, the leaderful role is being able to maintain an eye on all three of those levels. So at the very, very high public policy level, at the strategic level, at the initiative itself, and then at an operational level, although I'm not managing the operational piece, to be able to understand that decisions we make at the strategy level will impact the operations and how do those two interface. So that is a very current example of a significant leadership role that I'm particularly proud of, because we have taken this initiative to places where it has not gone before. I believe as a result of my interaction with thought leadership, as well as individual leadership dealing with various stakeholders, staff members, and so on, to move the initiative forward. There was a time when I was responsible for leading a program that provided education to internationally educated individuals. And within the institution that I worked, we needed to relook at the format of this program. Was it making a difference to the students? Was it making a difference to the healthcare system? Was it filling the needs? At the same time, was it filling the requirements of the educational institution? Was it meeting the academic requirements? There was, of course, a financial piece as well. Was it financially feasible? And when we took a look at that, we determined that it would be in the best interest of the organization and the students to stop that program for a year, reconfigure it, and put it back online. We were very clear on why we had to do this. We were very clear on the importance of doing this, and we understood some of the risks. Unfortunately, it was not a very popular decision with some of our stakeholders, and we understood that that would be the case. So the lesson that I learned from that experience was sometimes you do have to make difficult decisions, and sometimes they're not popular. But the best thing to do is to approach those individuals and have a discussion and deal with the consequences straight on. In that case, we had to go and have a very difficult discussion with a regulatory body to say that we will not be offering a program, which was the only program in Ontario, to allow these internationally educated folks to graduate. Their response was, well, who is going to deal with these folks? And we had to discuss the fact that a year later, when the program went back online, the product would be better, leading to better outcomes in the healthcare system. We could have sent a letter, we could have sent an email saying that this is the case, but that wouldn't have dealt with the issue, which was the communication between individuals. I think this is an important lesson from a leadership perspective as well, and we'll talk about that a bit more through some of the other questions, is the importance of communication in leadership. It is of utmost importance whether you're working in interprofessional teams, whether you're managing a team yourself, or whether you have a single person that you report to. Communication is key, and leadership is using communication as an effective tool to achieve a positive outcome. When I worked in an acute care hospital, I was managing 2 laboratories at the time, and one of which did laboratory analysis on prenatal specimens. So there was a very important turnaround time that we had to meet that was supported by international and national standards. And possibly due to workload issues, possibly due to staffing issues, our turnaround time started to slip. So we did have systems in place to actually track turnaround times. And we did track them on a monthly basis, and we noticed month to month that they were starting to slip. Unfortunately, these types of indicators don't help us because we find out after the fact that they've slipped, and these patients now have had to make some very difficult decisions because we haven't been able to get the results to them on time. So my role was to reduce those turnaround times. So I went into my staff and said, we need to get these turnaround times down. And there were a lot of negative reactions. There were a lot of reasons why that couldn't happen. But I had to persuade my staff to take action to find a way to reduce these turnaround times without using extra financial resources, meaning you couldn't stay and do 6 hours of overtime every day. That's impossible, they said. We're working too hard, they said. So I worked with them to focus on process improvement. I worked with them to enable them to find the solutions to the problems. And at the same time, I implemented real-time charting of turnaround times. So every single day, cases were going in and out, and we were tracking the turnaround times and the workload for each and every medical laboratory technologist. And that was also posted for everybody to see. The turnaround times decreased dramatically, and for the first time in 4 years, we hit our target. And we continued to hit that target for many, many more months after that. It was very, very labor intensive on my part and very labor intensive on a system, from a systems perspective, to constantly be on top of our folks. But at the end of the day, part of the reason it worked was because the individuals themselves not only saw that we could track the data and chart the data, but they also understood the importance of the data. I don't think without the graphical representations, they really understood how many patients were not getting their results within a certain time frame. And it can be said in the context of medical laboratory technologists, and I hear this all the time, that folks don't know if we're patient-centered or not because we don't see patients. We see samples, we see blood samples, we see whatever type of sample you see. My experience is that medical laboratory technologists actually are very, very patient-centered. However, sometimes our impact, collective impact, is lost on us because we deal with individual samples. We lose touch with the fact that every single day hundreds of thousands of specimens are being processed and hundreds of thousands of results are being put out, and the impact on the healthcare system is quite immense, actually. So once these MLTs started to see the impact that they were having, or the lack of impact due to the delayed turnaround times, I think it put the issue right in their face, and it helped persuade them to be part of the solution. So as I discussed earlier, I believe that leadership has two pieces, a personal and a positional role. And early on in my career, I was in a position where I had a positional role, but didn't have the personality traits to be a leader at that point. I was in a position very early on, actually while I was still in university, where I was responsible for a large group of individuals, and I was fresh out of high school, hadn't taken a leadership course or a management course, and really had to rely on my gut instincts on how to get through some difficult situations. This situation sticks with me even to today, where an individual that worked in our environment but was a junior level person made a bad decision. And I decided that I wanted to come down very, very hard on this individual and have severe repercussions for their behavior and their judgment, and that's exactly what happened. 3 months later, one of my senior staff members did exactly the same thing. But because this individual was one of my senior staff members, and I was worried about the repercussions of reprimanding him, what if I lost him, I was more lenient. A few weeks later, I was called into a meeting with all the staff, and they confronted me and said, how could you, as the leader, treat this one individual a certain way and your senior person another way? It was a very big lesson that I've carried with me through to today, that consistency is important in a leadership role. consistency is important as a value and a belief, but it's also in your behaviors across the board. Because if you don't apply consistency, your credibility as a leader diminishes very quickly. The anticipated problems that I've experienced usually have to do with, let's call them leadership problems around managing individuals. My experience in leadership is that more and more leadership involves collaboration. And collaboration usually puts some really great brains together to talk through a problem and find solutions and come up with processes to achieve a certain outcome or initiative or what have you. All that to say that when you collaborate with folks, the outcome is usually quite rich. People have thought of all the details, the contingencies, the processes, the steps in the processes all go usually very smoothly. Somebody is always there to think at it from a different perspective. So the problems that I've experienced aren't necessarily anticipated situational problems or process problems. They're interprofessional problems and communication problems. So the anticipation is, okay, if we make that decision, what does that individual, how would that individual feel, how it'll affect them? You may be in a meeting and you may see that everyone agrees to something, but one person's body language is telling you that they're not comfortable, but don't want to bring it up in the middle of the meeting. So it's mitigating the interpersonal risks by communicating. It's going after the meeting and talking with that individual and saying, I picked up that there was something that we talked about that was uncomfortable to you. So my experience has been less. There have been experiences where we have to mitigate tangible problems. Why is this process step doing this and not that? Why is the IT solution not doing this and not doing that? But I find less and less of that as a collaborative approach to problem solving becomes more and more prevalent. But the interpersonal stuff and the communication stuff remains, and those are the important problems that you need to anticipate and deal with head on. When I was working as a bench technologist in genetics, and as most MLTs will know, technology changes constantly within the laboratories, in genetics even more so, because it's still a somewhat evolving field. And at the time when I was practicing in this one clinical laboratory, we were changing technology platforms completely from one modality of testing to another. The same test, but just done a different way. And I wanted to tell this story because I think it's important to delineate the difference between formal and informal leadership. So at the time, my position was medical laboratory technologist. I could say I was just a lonely bench tech. But I could apply a leaderful mindset and demonstrate leaderful behaviors even without having the position. We knew that we were moving to this platform. We knew that it was inevitable. And I took it upon myself to get excited about it, to be a cheerleader for the group because we were all involved, to really take an active approach in developing the tests that we're moving over, to then sharing that knowledge with my peers and colleagues, to coaching them along as they were moving tests over themselves, and when they ran into problems, to be there for them as a mentor. And all of this led to nothing personally for me. All the tests move over, turnaround times went down, patient care was improved, all wonderful things. I didn't get a promotion out of it or a raise, but it allowed me to develop my leaderful behaviors in a safe environment, where my boss at the time said, if you want to take this and run with it, by all means do, and thank you for doing that because we need a champion in the lab. So I saw an opportunity for my own professional development and personal development and took it in an informal leadership role. In my first management role in the laboratory, I was still relatively wet behind the ears, fresh out of health admin school, had the knowledge, had some informal leadership positions, if you want to call that, or opportunities. But this was my first real chance. And the individual who gave me that chance was a wonderful mentor and really took the time to help me, coach me, watch me to make sure I was doing things the right way until, as he used to say, he'd cut the cord. He'd kind of let me go. This was a relatively large group of individuals that I managed, 40 people, which in healthcare is not that huge, but as a first-time leader under 30 years old, that's a lot of people for your first time. And we had a lot of things to do. We had a lot of testing to do, but we also had a lot of opportunities for improvement. Opportunities for improvement equals change, and change equals difficulty. Most people don't like change. My experience through this was to try to set up exactly that type of environment where differences were valued, encouraged, and supported. And the way that I did that was as follows. We had to re-engineer a process. We sat down, and my role, I believed, as manager was to try to set the end result, the desired end goal. We would like to get there, number one. Number two, do we all agree that there is a good place to go? Yes. Okay, so we have now a common touch point. So now, how do we get there? Well, that's where I learned that to create an environment where differences are valued, encouraged, and supported means being open to hearing and listening what others have to say and encouraging individuals to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. I didn't encourage naysayers, but I also didn't shut down naysayers. What I would shut down would be negativity. And that's part of setting the boundaries and the framework. Okay, folks, we're getting a little bit too far down the path of being a negative Nelly about this. Let's refocus. If these are the issues, what are the solutions? And listening, and listening, and listening. Also demonstrating as a behavior that I was not always right. So I might have an idea of which way things should go. I might even have an idea what the outcome should be, and through our journey of getting there, find that the outcome that I thought I wanted wasn't exactly what we really wanted, or it could have been improved upon by somebody else. So letting individuals that report to you educate you about what you might want and how you might want to get there, show some vulnerability and humility that I think goes a long way to establishing an environment where differences are valued, encouraged, and supported. When I was thinking about this question and preparing for today, I pictured myself as a leader, and I've been in that position numerous times, which I'm very grateful for. And at times, not to sound cliche, it can be very lonely. I think of you're the first person out there, you're the head of the pack, which is great because you can chart new territory, but it can also be very scary, and you're also a very, very easy target. You have to deal with all of the positivity, you have to also deal with all the negativity of change management that comes with always being the positive force. That's very difficult to do at times, to constantly be positive. So I think in addition to leading and motivating others, it's important for leaders to think about what can they do to lead and motivate themselves, to get through those days, to continually learn, to continually want to learn, to continually to want to change, and to focus on what's important. I don't have an answer. I think it depends on the individual, but I think it's important for leaders in healthcare to spend some time thinking about that. How do they lead and motivate themselves? How do they recharge their batteries so they can approach every day with the same passion and vigor that they did the day before?